This little girl was accidentally murdered in her own home. On August 14th, 2019, 9-year-old Benoit was in her kitchen getting a snack when she was shot in the head from a bullet outside of her house in Old East Dallas. The shooter, Devontae Benton, was targeting a rapper who apparently was speaking about him and his friend in his lyrics, and he came after him thinking he was shooting into his home, but he actually shot into the wrong house, murdering this 9-year-old little girl. Benoit and her family were actually neighbors with this person that was being targeted, and unfortunately that cost her life. The little girl was found by her grandmother face down on the floor, and she was lifeless. Devontae was charged with murder and was sentenced to almost 50 years in prison.
Have you ever wondered how accurate police sketches are? So this is a police sketch in one of the most high-profile murder cases happening right now. He's wanted for the 2017 murders of Libby German and Abby Williams, who were killed while out for a walk in Delphi, Indiana. And this is Richard Allen, who was just arrested as a suspect in the case. In another video, I actually showed you this sketch here, which was the first police sketch made in the investigation. And Richard actually looks so dissimilar to that photo that this is actually a picture of him posing next to it, and no one noticed. One of the craziest things about this case is right before the girls were murdered, they actually captured this image on one of their phones, and this is who police believe is the murderer. Specific details on the case remain under wraps. I mean, cops won't even release how the girls died, but I can definitely see it.
Blood-curdling facts that you wish you never knew. Part 27. When 14-year-old George Stinney was executed via electric chair, he was too short for the chair, so he used his Bible as a booster seat. He was later found out to be innocent. In the 1600s, Athanasius Kircher invented a musical instrument made out of cats. He would place them in a row according to the tone of their voice, stretching their tails under a keyboard made out of sharp nails. Texas had absolutely no regulations on natural gas until 1937, when a school blew up, killing 295 students and teachers. No one was held responsible, and the event was so bad that even Hitler sent a letter of condolence.
So there's this Reddit thread right now that says, I worked in a California state prison for 20 years, and these are some of my paranormal experiences. And the stories in this thread are legitimately terrifying. But the scariest one is probably that one night a guard was down in solitary confinement counting all of the prisoners in each cell, just making sure that all 28 prisoners were accounted for. Each prisoner was supposed to have the appropriate paperwork filled out for them, but he noticed that there was one extra prisoner with no paperwork filled out. So the guy goes back to his station and calls his supervisor to ask about this unregistered prisoner. But the supervisor said no one should be in that cell. So the guard quickly runs back to the cell, but by that point, the mysterious prisoner is no longer there. And then he goes on to say that other guards had the same thing happen to them too. And if you've had any paranormal experiences, make sure you email me for a chance to be featured on my podcast.
Mystery surrounds this new, incredibly disturbing true crime case. On the 25th of September, housekeeping staff at the Marriott Hotel in Philadelphia Airport made a horrific discovery. An American Airlines flight attendant had been found dead in the room. All we know at this stage is the woman is 66 years old and her name is Diana Ramos. Mysteriously, she was found deceased with a sock in her mouth at 10:45 p.m. on the day in question. The hotel directly connects to the Philadelphia International Airport, and the victim had been due to check out 2 days prior. It's believed that there was no signs of forced entry or a struggle. Investigators are obviously treating this death as suspicious. The actual cause of death has not yet been released. Investigators have told the press that they found sealed bottles of prescription medication in the woman's room. One flight attendant stated, "Everybody is still trying to figure out what happened and why her crew just left her." It's believed that her crew was LA based. Obviously in this case there remains an awful lot of unanswered questions.
I thought I had heard about the worst human experiments, but I was wrong. So back in the 1950s, there was a woman named Gail who went to the doctor complaining about anxiety. And the doctor told her they had this new treatment for anxiety if she wanted to try it. Also, I did a whole episode on this story if you want to hear the entire thing. So first he brings Gail into this room where he tells her he's going to give her a few electroshocks, which was normal at the time. But then, without preparing her, he gives her 15 times the maximum dosage of electroshocks. And after he does this, Gail starts writhing around on the floor and sucking her thumb, acting like a baby. Her brain was so scrambled from the shocks, she thought she was a child again. But this is exactly what the doctor wanted. So after all this happens, he gets Gail out of there and he puts her straight into a drug-induced coma. And when she's in the coma, he starts playing tapes on a loop for her, and some of them say things like, "I'm a good member of society." So the experiment the doctor was running was he wanted to see if he could take Gail's personality out of her through electroshocks and drugs, and then put another one inside of her. Gail was kept in this study for months, and she was released with the other subjects once the doctor figured out that what he was doing wasn't working. Anyways, the story is wild, and you should check out the full episode if you want to hear the whole thing.
Yet again, there's been another mass shooting in the US. Yesterday morning, 25-year-old Connor Sturgeon walked into Old National Bank in Louisville, Kentucky and opened fire, killing 5 people and injuring 8 others. Connor was actually an employee at this bank and had a shift that morning when he opened fire during a morning meeting. During that morning meeting, the room was filled with people, including the brand manager who was there virtually, and she saw everything unfold. Connor purchased an AR-15 rifle days before the attack and left a chilling voicemail to his friend saying that he felt suicidal and was gonna kill everyone at the bank. Which this all sounds familiar and very similar to the shooting that happened 2 weeks ago with Audrey Hale. When police arrived to the scene, there was a shootout, leaving 2 officers wounded and 1 in critical condition. During the confrontation, Connor was killed. Now, this story gets even more sinister. Connor apparently posted this on his Instagram story hours before the shooting. He even went about live streaming the attack, but it has been taken down. Many people who knew Connor are very shocked because they describe him as being a very calm and intelligent person. These are all the victims that lost their lives on that morning, and investigators said that this does seem to be a targeted attack, but the motive is still under investigation.
This man murdered his ex-girlfriend by throwing her off a balcony. It was Valentine's Day 2020. Well-known Hollywood therapist Dr. Amy Harwick was letting her hair down with friends at a burlesque show. When the evening was over, she headed back to her Hollywood Hills home. However, the 38-year-old had no idea of the horror that awaited her. Amy was hugely successful and widely known. She was also once engaged to famous comedian Drew Carey, and she was used to being in the public eye. However, her life was far from picture perfect. After splitting with her ex-boyfriend Gareth Pursehouse, she'd been forced to take out 2 restraining orders due to his behaviour. She had once written in an email that he was obsessive and scary. When she returned home on the night in question at around 1 AM, the now 45-year-old was waiting for her. Terrifyingly, Gareth strangled her in her 3rd-floor bedroom. It's believed that when Gareth heard Amy's roommate screaming to try and get help, he then threw her 20 feet over the balcony. Amy landed on the patio and police officers and ambulance raced to the scene. She was rushed to hospital but tragically died 2 hours later. Gareth's DNA was all over the crime scene, and clearly Amy had previously expressed concerns over his behaviour. He has now been found guilty of her murder and is facing a life sentence.
This cult leader gave children baths and then assaulted them. This is Michael Olurumbi, one of the worst pedophiles in British history. So this is Michael Olurumbi. He was born in Nigeria, moved to England, and eventually started a small church inside of his home. This church, called the Cherubim and Seraphim Church, was operated out of his home and had about 40 members. Starting in 1989, Michael would sexually abuse children for a period of over 20 years. So apparently all these crimes took place at his house under the guise of religious guidance. He and his wife would take children to the upstairs bathroom in their homes and give them a spiritual bath. And usually these minors were either naked or wearing only a small red sash. Before or during this bath, he would force children to drink perfume, and then during the process, he would sexually assault them. Once again, with the help of his wife, and apparently this happened over 88 times. He claimed that these were instructions from God, that he was told by God to bathe these children, to assault them, and then he would tell the kids that if they didn't comply, they could turn into a witch, or they would fail all of their school exams, or someone in their family would die. When one of the victim's parents confronted him eventually, he claimed that all of a sudden all of this was brought on by the devil. He was being possessed by the devil. He said that he was an animal in human skin. But when 4 of his victims became pregnant, he forced them to terminate their pregnancies. One girl who suffered abuse for many years even claimed that she was forced to terminate 5 to 6 different pregnancies by Michael. Eventually, though, a victim brought all this information to the police, and he was finally arrested in 2018. He was actually arrested at the Birmingham airport when he was attempting to travel to Nigeria, and like I said before, he had been working as a priest, a pastor, for years while all of this was going on. Eventually, his wife, who helped run this cult and helped facilitate all these terrible acts, was sentenced to 11 years in prison, and Michael was sentenced to a measly 34 years. I don't think that that's even close to as much as this guy should have gotten, but he is in prison now. He was just sentenced and convicted in 2020.
Quite a few of you have asked me to cover this case now, and it's definitely one that needs more attention. It's the death of Noah Donahoe, and something about this case just does not add up. If you're not familiar with this one, this is Noah Donahoe, and he was a 14-year-old boy that went missing while out riding his bike on June 21st, 2020 in Belfast. His body was found 6 days later in this storm drain, miles from home. He was naked, no helmet, no backpack, everything was missing. A medical examiner concluded that he died from drowning, and his death was ruled not suspicious and accidental. On the day of Noah's disappearance, he'd been seen by multiple people riding his bike. He was fully clothed, had a helmet on and his backpack. Shortly after these sightings, he was seen again, but this time he was riding his bike completely naked. He'd lost his helmet, he'd lost his backpack. He was riding his bike frantically and looking over his shoulder. He was also miles away from home and miles away from where he was supposed to be meeting his friends. When he failed to come home that night, his mum Fiona reported him missing. His bike was found, as was his mobile phone, but his clothes were nowhere to be found, and his backpack was missing too. When Noah's body was found, police concluded that he'd gone into that storm drain of his own free will, and he'd somehow got stuck and drowned. According to them, that's where his body had been for those 6 days. Now, this is a storm drain that fills up twice a day when the tide comes in. It's also filled with sewage, and Noah's body had little damage. The only water damage was to his hands and feet. There was no damage from rodents, insects, or the sewage that was in that drain, despite the fact that he'd been in there for almost a week. The police announced that there was no foul play and that Noah must have come off his bike, hit his head, and become disoriented and entered the storm drain by himself. Strangely, Noah's clothes were never found, but his backpack and his laptop were. They were found in the possession of a local criminal called Daryl Paul. Daryl claimed that he'd found the backpack and he'd actually tried to pawn the laptop while Noah was still missing. He received a 3-month sentence for finding and stealing Noah's possessions. Still to this day, over 3 years since Noah's death, his family is still looking for answers. They don't believe that his death was accidental. Noah's body was cremated rather than being buried, and the reason is heartbreaking. Noah was terrified of the dark, and that's one reason his mum Fiona does not believe that he would have climbed into that storm drain by himself. There are so many different theories surrounding this story, and I pray that Fiona gets the answers that she deserves one day.
This is William Goad, the worst pedophile in British history. This story has been compared many times to Jeffrey Epstein's story, and the pedophile ring surrounding this guy is something that nobody talks about and should be talked about. William Goad was born in 1994, and when he was arrested eventually, he was worth a ton of money. So in 1991, William opened Cornish Market World, a business which eventually became Britain's #1 largest indoor market. A few years later, he also opened Ben's Play World, a children's play zone which hosted activities for kids ranging from ages 2 to 12 years old. And at one point, his fortune was estimated to be around £25 million. But this entire time when he was building this huge business, he was one of the worst pedophiles in the world. In fact, it's been alleged nowadays that his victims number in the thousands. He even stated at one point that he wanted to beat his record of abusing 142 boys in a year. And the police have stated that they believe that he actually did do this. So William basically had this open door policy at his houses. He had a number of properties. He would allow anybody to come in and hang out, party, smoke, and this is where he would assault minors, at his own houses. He also hired a lot of young boys to work for him, and he would assault them at work. And he also had a camping club that he opened, and he would assault kids on camping trips. Now, for years, children had been coming to the police in England and telling them that this man had assaulted them. But the police turned a blind eye. I mean, William was a very successful businessman and a cornerstone of the community, so their cries for help were ignored. According to a number of minors that were at these parties, William would host these events where children were being assaulted, and they would oftentimes see prominent figures from British media. They would see government officials, and they would see much older men that seemed to be very wealthy. And William was setting up these parties and events so that these men, these powerful, connected men, could come abuse these children freely. Kinda rings a bell, doesn't it? For years, British officials have been trying to contact all the victims of William Goad, but it's just impossible. There are so many. Also, a lot of his victims ended up taking their own lives or trying to take their own lives. One young boy set himself on fire, and a lot of them also ended up on drugs, alcohol, or in prison. According to one news report, they went to meet one of his alleged victims, and when he walked into the room in the prison, he claimed he was the top dog of the prison, a really tough guy. But when they brought up William Goad's name, this guy who had walked in with a puffed up chest slunk down into his seat. It was like they had just reawakened and brought up a nightmare. But William had this whole system of procuring children as well. He would even have minors abduct other minors to bring to him to abuse. And if they didn't bring them the children that he wanted to abuse that day, he would abuse the children he tasked to do it even harder. Police have stated that the crimes in this case have taken place over 4 decades. And once again, they are still trying to find out the extent of the victims. Now, William Goad died in prison in 2012 and took a lot of his secrets to the grave. But I really do think that people should be talking more about this. Who was involved in this pedophile ring? Who was present at these parties where these horrific things were happening? None of them have ever been held accountable. If you want a part 2 of the story, let me know. It gets so crazy.
Chris Benoit was a WWE Triple Crown champion. In the 90s, this gentle giant was a legend in the wrestling world, and he appeared to be a loving husband and father at home. But something changed, and exactly 16 years ago to the day, on the 24th of June 2007, Chris became a murderer. His victims were his wife and his son. Christopher Michael Benoit was born on May 21st, 1967 in Montreal to parents Michael and Margaret. When Chris was 12, his love of wrestling began when he went to see his first local wrestling event, featuring Tom Billington and Bret Hart. He knew at that moment that he was destined for the ring. He went on to train with his hero Bret Hart at the family gym, where other legends such as Fritz von Erich and Chris Jericho had also trained. Chris made his wrestling debut in Stu Hart's Stampede wrestling promotion, where he tag-teamed with Rick Patterson against Butch Moffett and Mike Hammer. In 1989, Chris began training with Eddie Guerrero, who became a lifelong friend. And in 1994, he added Extreme Championship Wrestling to his schedule. However, at one of their events, Chris actually broke someone's neck in the ring during the opening seconds of a match, and in 1995 he returned to World Championship Wrestling. This is where things started to take a turn for Chris. In wrestling, there's an element of faking storylines, and Chris was expected to fake a feud with Kevin Sullivan over an affair with his wife Nancy. Only this fake affair turned into a real one, and Chris and Nancy fell in love. She left Kevin for Chris, and this would be the biggest mistake of her life. Through the late 90s, Chris won the US title multiple times and the World Heavyweight Championship in 2000. But when Nancy's ex Kevin was made head booker, Chris jumped ship to WWE. Chris made his debut on January 31st, 2000 with pal Eddie Guerrero. In his first year, he won the Intercontinental Championship 3 times, as well as becoming only the second man in history to win the Royal Rumble from the number 1 position. In 2004, Chris took on Shawn Michaels and Triple H in a triple match threat. He won by choking Triple H into submission using his trademark crippler crossface maneuver. That same night, his pal Eddie won the WWE Championship title. During his wrestling career, Chris had fathered 3 children, David and Megan to his first wife, and then in 2000, Nancy gave birth to his 3rd son, Daniel, and the couple got married shortly after. Everything seemed to be going perfectly for the family, but behind closed doors, Chris had actually become quite violent, and after just 3 years of marriage, Nancy filed for divorce and took out a restraining order. Chris actually managed to convince her to drop both and stay married to him, and this decision would be the death of her. Chris's wrestling career continued, and he went on to win 22 major titles, but behind the glitz and glam, Chris was really struggling. He began taking testosterone and steroids, and as a side effect, his behaviour became really unpredictable. He was both inflicting and receiving vicious injuries in the ring, including multiple blows to the head. And in 2005, Chris took a major blow mentally when he lost his good friend Eddie Guerrero to acute heart failure. Eddie had been one of a group of wrestlers taking a drug called HCG, as well as steroids, which had enlarged his heart, leading to his death. Chris's mental health went on a major downward spiral, and he became even more violent at home. The tiniest thing could set him off, and he'd take it out on Nancy and Daniel. In June 2007, WWE handed Chris a monster championship push and booked him to win the World Championship on June 24, 2007. Only Chris would never make that match. On June 15th, Chris's good friend and fellow wrestler Sherry Martel died of a drug overdose, and this was the final straw for Chris. On the morning of June 24, 2007, Eddie Guerrero's nephew received a series of cryptic texts from both Chris's and Nancy's phones. One of them said, "The dogs are in the pool area and the back door is open," followed by their address. He immediately knew something was wrong and the police were called to do a welfare check. When police entered the house, they found Nancy's body wrapped in a towel, and the bruises on her back indicated that an attacker had pushed their knee into her back while pulling on a cord wrapped around her neck. Next, police found 7-year-old Daniel, and the marks on his body were very similar to those of the opponents that Chris faced in the ring, showing that he'd actually used his trademark manoeuvre, the crippler crossface, to murder his son. The police then went into the basement and found Chris. His body was hanging on a lateral pull-down gym machine. He'd tied a cord around his neck, put it on the highest weight setting, and then let go, breaking his neck instantly. Chris's autopsy showed Xanax and hydrocodone in his system, as well as a whopping 10 times the amount of testosterone found in a normal man. His heart was 3 times the size it should have been, and he showed symptoms of the same condition that killed his friend Eddie. Chris's brain scans showed that it was that damaged that it actually resembled the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. It was confirmed that the damage to his brain wasn't caused by steroid use, it was caused by the multiple blows to the head that he received in the ring. Chris was also diagnosed with something that was new at the time, called CTE. Just a year before Chris's death, American footballer Mike Webster also died, and his autopsy gave him the label of the first American footballer to be diagnosed with CTE. This called for further studies, and as the years went by, more and more cases were found in people with such professions as American football, boxing and wrestling. Symptoms of CTE include poor judgment, impulsive behaviour, suicidal thoughts and depression, all of which were exhibited by Chris Benoit. It's thought that a mixture of the drug and steroid abuse and the multiple blows to the head in the ring both contributed to Chris's final tragic days. The whole tragic situation was a PR disaster for the wrestling world, especially highlighting their flawed drug testing. Chris Benoit's death put them under investigation to look at their culpability, and they've since started taking their wellness policy more seriously, concentrating on their performers' mental health as well as their physical health.
The man smiling in this photo was arrested after hunting down and brutalizing pedophiles, earning him the nickname, the Alaskan Avenger. As a kid, Jason Vukovich was sexually and physically abused by his stepfather Larry until he ran away from home at the age of 16. Larry was charged with the abuse of a minor but never served any jail time, and as the years passed, Jason grew haunted by his stepfather. He reached a breaking point in 2016 when he decided to use his state sex offender registry to track down criminals, break into their homes, and beat them with a hammer. In 2018, Jason was sentenced to 28 years in prison and has since come out apologizing for his actions. He says that vigilantes have no place in society and warns that just because your past was taken from you, you shouldn't ruin the future that you have ahead. The woman in this photo is Barbara Bakeland, a model from the 1960s who slept with her own son in order to turn him straight. When Tony revealed to his parents that he was gay, it didn't exactly align with their morals, so Barbara went out and hired several prostitutes to be with her son. However, this obviously didn't work, so Barbara took it upon herself, saying to her sister, "You know, I could get Tony over his homosexuality if I just took him to bed." Well, she did, and a few years later in 1972, he snapped. Tony stabbed his mother in the heart, killing her instantly, and was sent to a psychiatric hospital to receive therapy. There, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and just a few days after his release, he murdered his grandmother and was taken into custody. But on the day of his prison sentence, Tony Bakeland was found dead in his prison cell, having taken his own life with a plastic bag.
Here's a face that's been all over the news lately. Usually you'd see a photo like this with the title murder trial and assume that they're the victim, but not in this case. 32-year-old Lucy Letby has been charged with taking the lives of 7 babies and attempting to take 10 more. She was working as a neonatal nurse at the Countess of Chester Hospital from June 2015 to June 2016, and this was the time span in which these infants passed away. She was finally removed from the neonatal unit after a senior doctor realised that she was the only common denominator for all of these children. Lucy Letby has pleaded not guilty on all accounts. So her defence team have said that it's just a coincidence that she was present at the passing of every child. They've also said that the passings were natural and not caused by any human interference. The prosecution, however, have presented evidence stating that the victims' lives were deliberately taken, mainly by injecting air into their circulation. Police also supposedly recovered some major evidence from her home after her arrest in 2018. The evidence was a handwritten note, with one section of it reading the following: "I unalived them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them." Well, I guess, take from that what you will. A case that ended with a shocking twist. On the 19th of February in 2008, 9-year-old Shannon Louise Matthews was reported missing by her mother, Karen. Shannon was last seen at 3:10 outside of her school, only half a mile away from her home. By the time Karen called 999, it was 6:48 p.m. in Dewsbury, West Yorkshire, and Shannon still hadn't returned home from school. Within hours of her disappearance, a massive police search began, ultimately involving over 250 officers and 60 detectives. Hundreds of neighbours, friends and family joined Karen Matthews in the search for her daughter. Karen made TV appearances begging the public to help her find Shannon alive. The Sun newspaper even offered a £50,000 reward to anyone who could provide information that helped with the investigation. But after 20 days of endless searching, Shannon was still nowhere to be seen. That was until the 14th of March, 24 days after she was first reported missing. Police had finally located Shannon, and she was alive. For 24 days, she had been hidden in the base of a bed in a flat belonging to a man named Michael Donovan. And Michael Donovan was the uncle of her mum Karen's boyfriend. So it turned out that Shannon's mum Karen was involved in her daughter's kidnapping all along. She had concocted this abduction plan hoping to claim the reward money after her daughter's safe return. Shannon was understandably shaken after this ordeal. She'd spent over 3 weeks restrained inside a bed, regularly being given substances as a means to sedate her. Ultimately, Karen Matthews and Michael Donovan were found guilty of kidnapping and false imprisonment, and obstructing the course of justice. But both have since been released from prison and are living under new identities. Shannon received regular therapy after the incident, later being given a new identity and being placed with a foster family.
What? Nothing there, mate. Nothing there. What? There's nothing there.
This case made me terrified to go to the cinema. This is the case of the horror in Screen 9. James Holmes was raised in California. His mum was a nurse and his dad was a scientist. From a young age, he was experiencing night terrors and allegedly actually tried to take his own life when he was just 11 years old. He was apparently obsessed with guns and weapons and had dreamed of becoming a mass murderer. Between May and July 2012, he legally bought 4 guns. Background checks were conducted and he was allowed the weapons. He also bought spike strips, which, if you don't know, pop the tyres of cars if they chase after you. On July the 19th, just hours before tragedy would unfold, James mailed his notebook to his psychiatrist. Inside the notebook, James detailed his plans to kill. The notebook was actually discovered later on undelivered. Just prior to entering a cinema in Aurora, James rang a crisis line to tell them about his plans to kill. However, the call was disconnected after just 9 seconds. At the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises, CCTV captures James walking into the cinema. He walks into Screen 9, props open the door and then walks back out again. Shockingly, he goes to his car and gets guns out and gas canisters. He re-entered the screen at about 12:38 p.m. and set off 2 gas canisters. When he entered Screen 9 again, he immediately opens fire on the audience, instantly killing 10 people. 2 others later died in hospital from their injuries. An additional 70 people were injured. This was an absolutely packed out cinema. James also shot at people as they scrambled to exit the screen. His youngest victim was a 6-year-old girl. Witnesses said this all unfolded as there was actually a gunfight on the screen, and initially they all thought it was special effects and just part of the film. Police were actually on the scene very quickly after the first 911 call. James surrendered to the police and was arrested in the car park. He was apparently very calm when he was arrested and told police that he had booby-trapped his apartment. When police investigated his apartment, this was found out to be true. He was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences.